Hi, listeners. I am Laura Humm. I am one of the Dialogue Doctor editors, and I am so fortunate to be doing an episode with Judy Boxer today. Judy, will you introduce yourself to our readers, listeners? I guess they're not readers yet. Hopefully some of them read.
Someday if I ever finish this. Gosh, I'm sorry. I'm a little nervous.
It's okay.
I've been working on this project about my grandmother for many years. My grandmother had a really interesting life story, and she loved to tell stories. And I've been hearing the stories since I was a really little kid. And she kind of got me hooked on family history. I got really involved in genealogy and family history research. And after she passed, I found this trove of audio tapes my cousin had given her, maybe in her late 70s, early 80s, audio tape recorder. And she had just talked into it for years. And it was everything from television shows recorded to records to little snippets about her family and her and my grandfather's family. And I edited them all together. I digitized them, and then I edited them together and took out just the family history stuff and turned it into a little book for my family with photos and stuff. And
what a wonderful gift.
It got me thinking that it was really an amazing story and that it should be told. So trying to do that. But I've never written before, and I have a lot to learn. I've put myself into it and taken myself out of it. I've made it nonfiction and fiction, and I've, been struggling a bit with making her more three-dimensional. I mean, she was my grandma, so I loved her, and she certainly told the stories from the I'm perfect point of view, and that's not that interesting. So trying to make her more well-rounded, trying to put dialogue in without making it fiction, trying to figure out her character arc. I mean, I just have so many things I'm struggling with. So I jumped at the chance to work with a real editor.
Well, I'm not sure that I'd call myself a real editor, but I edit. Well, I'm so excited that to be talking to you about this. And you before our session, you shared a little bit of your grandmother's story with me, and it really it resonated with me so much to hear kind of like, first of all, how life has changed in the different generations, and but also like the triumphs and the struggles and the wonderful things that came out of her life. I'm really interested to hear some of the stories where she kind of made herself sound kind of like the perfect, but there were obviously some struggles there. That's such an interesting way of looking back on someone else's life, to kind of hear how they were the hero of their own story, which is wonderful. And like reading the story that you've kind of, just the outline that you've put together, it's a story that I really wanted to read. So I definitely think that there's space in the literary world for her story. And what a great gift that you have all of these audio recordings that you were then able to create into a book, so that you can then decide how you want to share it with the world.
So I think it's a little unique also because she was born in the late 1800s, and there's not that much first person writing by women from that long ago.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you mentioned that you put yourself in the story and you took yourself out of the story, and then you kind of put yourself back in the story. Will you share with us a little bit about kind of what you're thinking as it relates to you being in the story and you not being in the story?
So my first pass, my rough draft, I kind of reflected on what had happened in her life. Like, she has this really close relationship with her brother, and I talked about a little bit about my relationship with my brother. And then she talks about starting in a new school, and I talked about that a little bit, and that didn't seem to be working. So then I went back and put myself in as why I have the right to tell the story in terms of my interest in family history, and I actually went to Eastern Europe and visited her hometown and done all this research. That was kind of boring. So I took myself back out. And then I thought, I need to put myself in order to kind of tell which parts are my elaboration and which parts are her actual telling. And that's, I think, where I am now, but I'm still not sure. Like, it seems to break the story up a little bit. I don't want to pull the reader back out. So I'm still struggling a bit with whether to just tell her story and leave myself out, maybe put myself in the beginning and the end, a prologue and a, afterword or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. You're in such a unique position here because, one, you knew your grandmother, obviously, and you heard the stories and you have the recordings and you have the research and you have family members that I'm sure, if it's a story that she told a lot of times, it's interesting to think about, well, how did that story change as she told it different times? Or how did the story change when she told me versus when she told someone else? So then you have this question about, as I'm telling the story, what part of it needs to be truth so that it can be a nonfiction book, or what part of the story can be fictionalized a little bit and then it becomes like a pseudo memoir. So I imagine that's something that has been rattling around kind of in your mind a little bit.
Yeah. So if you, when they talk about with memoir that you recreate a dialogue as best you can from your memory, and it's okay.
Right.
I'm recreating it from someone else's telling. So does that make it fiction? If I make it dialogue, I know what happened, but I don't know the exact words that were said. If I just, I know I've read some where people will say, I imagine this is how the conversation went, or but that breaks it up so much to say that every time.
Right. Yeah. And then I think of a writer like Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote about her own life, but it is always a fictionalized genre of her life, while we're pretty sure that the stories actually happened in her life. And obviously you're not necessarily writing it in the children's genre, but that this idea that we can tell a story that's so realistic and so engaging and so honoring about someone's life in a fictionalized way and still honor the truth of it. So this is a place where I can help guide you from the standpoint of what's going to make the story the easiest to write, what's going to be most engaging for the readers. But as far as the rules of the genre of where something falls from nonfiction to memoir and then from memoir into fiction, I feel like there are people within the Dialogue Doctor community, or we can reach out to our colleagues outside that can help advise on that. But being as this is your first writing work, I would really encourage you to think about what feels best to you as you're telling the story. What's going to honor your grandmother's story, your memories of her the most? What's going to feel the best? Because, what you don't want to end up doing is writing this thing that's supposed to feel so good and so honoring and is supposed to connect you to your heritage and your children to their heritage. And then it end up feeling frustrating because you're trying to fit into a genre. Because, writing is an act of love. So you want to be able to honor that. So
but I also want it to be something that is readable.
Absolutely. Right. Because why else do we write other than to have other people read the story?
My rough draft was just kind of this happened, this happened, this happened, and it's just boring. No one would read it.
So let me ask you this. When you're thinking about how the story unfolds, when you sent the story to me, you sent it to me as her story from birth through the whole scope of her life.
Yeah, I know that's too much.
So when I read it, I was like, oh my gosh, I want to read more of this woman's story, even if it was told like child all the way up. So are you thinking that you want to tell it chronologically? Are you thinking you want to tell it more from the perspective of like highlights and struggles and that sort of thing? Or have you not kind of thought through how you want that chapter arc to go?
I mean, in my rough draft, I kind of started um, when her brother left, which she was about 6,
Mhm.
which was, there were kind of these like kind of 5 or 6 major events in her life, and I basically just
Mhm.
told those. I don't know.
Mhm.
And then, I used backstory a little bit to talk about, because she had been born into a wealthy family, but her father died when she was at 3, and that completely
Mhm.
changed them to poverty. Um, so, I put that in as backstory, and then
Mhm.
um, I kind of ended. She ended up marrying her very much older sister's husband to take care of the children after
Mhm.
her sister died, and then I kind of just flashed forward to, she has these 4 children and 9 grandchildren, and
Mhm.
life is good now. Um, so I don't know whether that's, I mean, they talk about with memoir, you're supposed to pick a specific event in your life, not tell a whole life story, but
Right. Right. So, and that's such an interesting thing because, when you're writing a memoir, you're telling your own story. And you mentioned a little while ago that you're not telling necessarily your own story, you're telling your grandmother's story. Now, if you were to kind of change the tone of that a little bit and to make it your memoir and how your grandmother influenced you, then, picking just one event in her life that kind of corresponded to your life. And you kind of mentioned that a little bit when you in your first draft, like you were talking about your relationship with your brother, your starting of a new school, how your grandmother kind of had a parallel story life. Um, that would work. If, on the other hand, you just want to tell her story, making it more biographical allows you kind of the breadth to tell the whole story. And, what I found so compelling about the story was this kind of like, if her father hadn't died, how would the whole trajectory of her life been different, knowing that the world wars were happening in her lifetime, right? Like, so, this idea that, this born into a wealthy family, losing her father at an early age, the family kind of splitting, you mentioned her brother leaving, the other siblings who were older had left, and like the connection of that. So I found that to be such an interesting story just in and of itself. Even if you were to start it with something happening, like you were talking about having a prologue that's about you and your relationship with her, and then turning it around to tell the story from, this is what her family looked like, this is what life looked like, and then the surprise of her brother leaving and the devastation because she was so close to him. He took care of her, right? He was her mentor, and then you, is it okay if I share a couple more details with,
yeah, no, it's
okay.
fine.
And then like to be at such a young age, to have to make a decision like she had to make about caring for her ailing mother, right? Like that is such a, like, just in the few sentences that I was reading, my heart was breaking for this character. So this is where, like, as a reader, even if you're fictionalizing those conversations, even if they're based off of like the memories of what your grandmother has in the tape recordings, and being able to bring that, but being able to fill in some of those details, maybe based off of pictures or based off of what you felt as you were walking the streets of her hometown and that sort of thing, I think can create a sense of like visualization that readers can really connect to. So there's definitely a story there in her life.
That's good. That's reassuring anyway.
Absolutely. So I would say that the next question, so obviously the kind of, if we're thinking about how do you make this decision, because the goal of this conversation is not for you to be able to have a decision made at the very end of our conversation. Though if you have a decision made at the end of our conversation, that's great. But more about like, what what is going to help you make your decisions about how to go forward, because you've been working on this project for quite some time now. I mean, if you digitized and organized and created a story with pictures, and then you wrote a first draft, and now I'm sorry, you're in a second draft or kind of a third draft. Where are you, would you say, in your process?
I'm not sure. I mean, I finished a rough draft, and then I've been just kind of going back to different places and trying to make it more in scene rather than, just this happened, this happened, this happened. So there's bits all through it where I've expanded it, and there's no place that feels at all finished.
Well, and that's honestly what I'm learning about the writing world is it sometimes never feels finished, even when it's published. So I would just encourage you that, projects, I think Jeff described to me once that projects are never done, they're just abandoned, right? Like you get to a place where you don't have it in you anymore to do anymore. So you move on to the next. But where you are in your process feels a lot like other writers feel in their processes, right? Where it's like, I have this idea, I have this kernel, I have a rough draft, but how do I take my rough draft into a draft or a manuscript that someone else wants to read, that I'm writing it for someone else, I'm not writing it for me as an author, right? Like, and obviously there are projects out there that we all do and we all write where we know it's like, it's just for us. And if somebody else reads it, wonderful. And if not, that's okay too. But when you want to become that writer, it's like taking that story and making it approachable for someone else. So as you're kind of thinking about the details and the decisions, the first question is, what feels best to you, right? Like, what story do you want to write? Do you want it to fall into one of these categories or not? I would say the second question, and we talked about that already, I would say the second question you want to ask yourself as a writer, as you're making these decisions, is, who is my audience going to be? Because again, you get into this place where you want readers. And there are so many different kinds of readers out there. And while most readers do cross genres, you also have kind of a target audience that you want to hit, and really kind of knowing what that audience is and what that audience craves can kind of help you make some of those decisions about what type of book do you want to read. So have you thought at all about, what kind of genre or what kind of reader do you want to target?
I mean, I guess my first target would be, people who are interested in family history and genealogy, and in particular, probably Jewish family history and genealogy, and and history, because I do feel like it's a unique. I mean, it's a unique view on that world, the early, immigrating in the early 1900s, and living in Eastern Europe, and then I guess, I don't know. I mean, in my ideal world, it would be, people who read memoir.
Wonderful. Now, are you thinking that you want this to be like, and I think that beach reads, I'm going to use the phrase beach reads because I think they evoke a certain kind of feeling, but at the same time, there's this kind of brush off about like, oh, I don't want to write a beach read, right? Like, but the reason that I'm using the phrase beach read is because beach reads have this like feel good, at least in my mind. I don't know, maybe people who write beach reads for a reason are going to come after me about like the way I'm talking about the genre. But to me, it's like this. I pick up a beach read because I want to connect with some characters. I want to learn their story. I want to live where they live. And yeah, maybe I go through their struggles with them. But when I finish the book, I feel good. I feel good about their story. I feel good about the time that I invested on my vacation to read the story. So that's kind of like one way you could look at your story, which helps in the making decisions because you want to focus on the feel good parts, right? So in any chapter you write where there's a struggle, you want to end it with hope. It doesn't have to be resolved, but you want to end it with hope. So like when her brother left, right? Like that's heavy and heartfelt, but you can still end it with a hope. Now, the other way you can look at it, and I am taking literature, which is so huge and so vast and so multi-genred, and I'm breaking it down into like 2, maybe 3 categories. But like you've got this kind of feel-good read, and then you've got this like memoir read, which is just like staying in the moment, and the weight of every moment is where you want your readers to connect. So like the sadness, the loss that she feels when her brother leaves, right? Like that's where you want your readers to sit because that's where she is. And then you can kind of create this, again, totally taking literature and breaking it where it shouldn't be. But then you can kind of create this idea of like, let the story go where the story goes, because if your readers are engaged in the story, they're going to feel the highs, they're going to feel the lows, and they're just going to be there for the storyline.
I think I'm more on that end of, I don't think I'm funny and light enough to be a beach read.
Okay. Okay, so here when we think about beach reads, they don't necessarily have to be funny and light. They just have, well, and again, maybe other people's definition of beach read in the way that I'm kind of thinking of this is like more of like does it make you feel good at the end or like throughout, right? Like pain matched with hope, like, oh, I don't like this, but I know it's going to get better, right? Like, because I've seen the end where she has all of this success. She has 4 wonderful children and 9 amazing grandchildren and however many great grandchildren, right? Like, is that like the key of like, she wins her life, which is where I kind of think the beach read can come in of like, not necessarily light and funny, but more like hope and success and all of that versus more of the like, we just want to feel what we're feeling in the moment, or this kind of like, hey, this woman had an amazing life. I just want to hear her story, which can,
it was pretty, I guess I don't think I can do the end each chapter with hope. I mean, I think she was kind of like hit after hit after hit. I mean, she had a lot of strikes against her.
Yeah.
And I think the perseverance was.
Yeah. And I love that you're talking about it that way, because that felt that obviously is coming across in the way you wrote your outline to me, because that's what I felt, right? Like, oh, this devastation, but then she went on and then things were going well. And then, oh, this, and then, right. Like, so that I think really resonated with me as a reader. And it really kind of leans you back toward what you've been saying is this like pseudo memoir of like, when you're reading a memoir, you really want to feel like the weight of those pain points and just kind of live in it versus even the last one, which is like, just, I'm here for her story, right? Like the worry at the end of a chapter of like, how am I going to continue as this small child without the person who's been my protector my whole life, right? And then, when her mother gets sick, this like, I don't really have a lot of choice here, but I'm going to fight for the part of the choice that I have. And then when she goes and her sister passes away and she's faced with this prospect of marrying this much, much older man so she can take care of the children, and obviously later coming to have her own children, but like the potential of what that could be like, right? Like us feeling the weight of that, especially because there was a difference in the time, right? Like you try to tell a story like that now where someone is faced with this option of like taking care of their siblings' children and marrying their sibling spouse in 2020, right? We're in 2020. No, we're in 2022. I don't know where we are.
No one would do it. Yeah.
Right. Like it just doesn't even become like a question anymore. But in the time period, like it didn't seem at all outrageous to
I
consider
think
this
that's
as
what
an
people
option.
did. I think it was a common.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So there you go. So you've kind of gone into the answer to question 2, which can then kind of help you because you know who your audience is, you know what kind of story you want to tell. Obviously that doesn't answer all the questions that there
No,
are
I mean,
doing that.
if it's going to be a memoir, I mean, from these memoir classes, what I've learned is you kind of have to have like a central theme, a central question, and a
Mhm.
character arc, and I can't quite figure that out.
So
That's
you
my next.
mentioned just a few seconds ago that her story is about perseverance.
Yeah.
So can perseverance be your theme?
I mean, isn't that too boring? I don't know. Like, is that enough?
So I think that where your story becomes enough is when you put the story on the page, right? So, and we talk about this at the Dialogue Doctor all the time about you can have a really compelling story written in a way that no one really wants to read because it's not allowing the reader to go on an emotional journey. On the flip side of that, you can tell a story that's super engaging to the reader, but when you put the book down, you kind of think as a reader, what really just happened in that book, right? Like, I was there for it. I was all in. I wanted to spend time with these characters, but nothing really happened. So, like, when I don't know if you listened to the podcast of the book club with Hemingway, and I guess it was The Sun Also Rises. I could be wrong on the title of that because I kind of blocked it out of my memory. Because Jeff and I were very polarized, and some of the other um, podcasters on that episode, we all kind of felt something different about the book. Some people felt really in the moment and didn't really care that nothing was happening in the story because they showed up for the characters and the way Hemingway created those conversations. Some of us felt a little bit differently as far as the story goes, but so for me, if Hemingway had taken, and of course, who am I to tell Hemingway how to write a story, right? Like, I have no business telling someone, but right, like for me, there were those moments where something was happening and I was so engaged with the story because there was so much dialogue and I felt like I was there with them. That really helped me get as far in the book as I did as I jumped from, story to story. Those were the places for me that I can understand why other people feel so passionate about Hemingway, because in those moments he brought it to life. I personally think he could have brought more to life, but other people disagree with me. So, and that's okay, right? Like, and that's the thing about readers is we don't all have to agree as readers on what makes great art. But it does help us to know when there is a character that we can know and we can love and we can connect with. So, excuse me. So
Yeah.
maybe you can be the next Hemingway.
No, I'd like to make her a character that people could love and connect with. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm there. I'm definitely not there yet. But
so then we can kind of talk about what makes a great character. And so there are a couple ways you can create a great character. There's having a great story, right? You can have a character who just is in interesting places, and we follow them because they're interesting, because their story is interesting. You can write a character. I'm trying to think of somebody who maybe readers have read who that happens to. So there's an author that I love, Karen Slaughter. She's in a very specific like thriller genre. So I don't know that people outside of the genre have heard
I'm
of
not
her.
a big thriller reader. Yeah.
Yeah. So she writes a series about a medical examiner in Georgia. And her characters are great. Her stories are great. Absolutely. But that's not why I picked up the book. I picked up the book because it was about a pediatrician in Georgia who also serves as her small town's medical examiner, right? Like that was what made that first story that I read of hers compelling. Yes, she created a character who was interesting and felt realistic, but like that's not why I picked up the book. So you can tell the story from like an interesting character, or you can create a character who is really three-dimensional and comes to life. We can learn more about the character as they go through the story. Now, what is potentially challenging for you, which also ends up being a really wonderful, exciting element to the story, is you're telling a life from childhood through adulthood, right? So when you're writing a story about an adult character who does adult things and you're really focusing in kind of on one moment, you need the character to have a voice that feels realistic, but also has the ability to modulate and grow. Writing about someone's life from childhood to adulthood, you have the ability to modulate the voice based off of growth. So that can be an interesting way for you to tell the story and create interest if you wanted to. The other way, would be to just take all of those things about your grandmother's storytelling and kind of bring them out. So I'm not really helping you here. I'm just telling you all the things that you already know of all the options that are on the table.
I really want to do that first thing that you've said, but I'm not sure. I definitely haven't done it yet. That's what I feel like I'm working towards is her growth and her voice developing. And like one of the things that you and Jeff talk about so much on the Dialogue Doctor is that you should be able to recognize people from their
dialogue.
And I definitely am not there yet. That's
okay.
That's a skill I have not gained yet.
Okay, so that's interesting, and that's really exciting. Obviously, for people who focus on voice all the time, it's super interesting to hear you want to talk about voice. So when you're writing the character voice, are you trying to capture your grandmother's voice as you remember her, or as she would have been as these moments are happening in her life?
I mean, her story really ends before I even was born, So it's more, trying to figure out who she was from the story. I mean, she's writing this. She's in her late 80s, writing about being 10. So I'm trying to figure out how to bring that out.
Sure.
It's really hard.
Sure. Oh yeah, absolutely. So there are a couple of ways, and again, thinking about, I'm just going to put more options on the table for you because you don't have enough options here. So like you could write the story, and again, this allows you to be in the story, which was something that you felt was an opportunity in an earlier draft, right? Like you can start the story with kind of these flashback moments. So you are having this conversation with your grandmother. She begins to tell the story. So the first part of the story, or each chapter, gets told as her remembering and telling it to you as a child. And then it kind of fades into her voice changing and she's in the moment. And she goes from having this like memory voice to this now, whatever age she is, voice, experiencing the moment. And then whether you end it in the time of the flashback or coming back is obviously another choice that you have. But that could be fun from a voice standpoint, from like the modulation of you can capture the voice that you remember of your grandmother telling you all these stories, and that you have all these tapes for, of like this, older person looking back over her life, making memories and sharing those memories of things that were important to her with people who are important to her, and then kind of flashing back and then allowing the story to be told from the 11-year-old or the she was 18, 20 when she was making decisions about being married. I'm sorry, I don't remember that detail.
Yeah, about, let's see, it was 19, yeah, she was about 20.
About 20, okay, yeah.
When her sister died, she was 20, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So she was young, right? Young in today's terms, about making a decision about, a future and that sort of thing. So that also gives you the ability to modulate voice in the way that we talk about in the Dialogue Doctor, because that voice modulation becomes a way of your readers to feel the moment, right? Like we all want to settle in and listen to our grandparents with their storytelling, right? Like part of the reason that I was so compelled by your grandmother's story is because it reminded me of sitting with my grandmother and hearing her stories, right? Like, and right before she was about to tell a story, her voice changed a little bit. And, it kind of got that soft, reminiscent moment. And, as a writer, you can create that moment in your dialogue, right? You can write it in this way where you put your dialogue tag and your body language before the quotation starts. So, she took a deep breath, her eyes fixed in the distance, and she sighed a moment before she said, and then it was, 1914, and right, like but you can kind of create that from the voice standpoint. And that's where the Dialogue Doctor can come alongside you and help you, like, if she's in reminiscent mode, she gets whatever this body language, and obviously you'll fill that body language in because you knew her, you remembered what that was like. And then her tone of voice and her cadence, we can take some of those things that you remember from listening to the tapes to figure out, was she this kind of storyteller who just, when she started telling the story, everything fell out of her mouth and it came quickly? Or was she more of a storyteller that, like, started the story and then thought for a moment and then went on with the story and then thought for a moment? However you want to honor her in that way, that's where the engagement comes in, because both types of storytellers are the kind that, like, have you on the edge of your seat. You're either listening for the what comes next, or you're listening for the, oh, this is going to be really good because she's remembering, right? Like, so kind of that's how you can take these moments that right now might feel a little bit flat to you, because they don't feel the same as when your grandmother was telling them, because you didn't have, like, the evoking of the memories of being in the moment. So that's how we can use voice to kind of pull you into the moment.
So would you begin, like, each chapter with kind of now and then go back?
So
Or would you
could
just
do
begin the
that.
whole book with now and then?
Yeah, so that unfortunately is something that I can't tell you.
Right.
I
I
can
figured
I
that out.
can tell you, I would, as a reader, while memoirs are not my favorite genre, when someone tells me you have to read this memoir, I'm all in for a memoir, right? It's not what I gravitate to, because it is a little bit different than, like, thriller mysteries, which is what I tend to gravitate to. But for me, it's like, am I reading because I'm trying to escape from my life, or am I reading because I have time and I just want to enjoy a story? That always plays a part in how I'm making a decision. So when someone else says, hey, read this memoir, I love it. So, but to answer your question, I think it depends on how you want to structure your story. If you're structuring your story as more of if we think about, like, the Titanic, James Cameron's The Titanic, right? Like, it starts with Rose remembering, the whole story is her remembering, and then it comes back to her at the end. Super compelling. You hear her voice as an old woman at the beginning and at the end, and it doesn't matter throughout the story. That's one way to do it. If for you, the story feels more natural with the connections that you had with your grandmother, which was in the later stages of her life, then you telling the story from, I was sitting next to her having tea, or, at this major life event that I was having, this is the story she shared with me of her life event at that time. Again, people are going to read that because the story is great. So it really comes down to, what do you want to write and what's going to feel best to you.
Okay.
So
Yeah, I
yeah,
kind
I
of
don't
like
have
that.
any answers. I just have more questions.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a lot to think about. That's great, though. You've given me lots of things to
Mhm.
think about. What about like the character arc kind of question of like who does she become, or what growth happens in her, or
So your character arc is built in that her story has already happened, right? Like, you're not a fiction writer creating somebody's story, so you have to figure out where they started and where they end. You're also, so in a traditional memoir, we've talked about this a couple of times, you're taking like one part of their life and you're focusing on one part of someone's life. While you want to kind of fit into this memoir genre, it feels as though you want to be able to tell her whole story. So by telling her whole story, you already have a character arc, right? You have a child who has no choice in the matter. You have a young teen who has no choice, but is fighting for the ability to have a choice so that things continue to go her way. She turned 16 and now she has choice again, but the pressure that she has is to make a choice that feels different than what her heart feels, right? Like, am I choosing between what I know and what I love and this potential opportunity for me? And then she's 20 and she's faced with another devastating loss and a promise that she's made. And it's like, so the arc is already there and the story is already there. It's just a matter of, do you tell it chronologically so we see that kind of story happen and unfold? Or do you tell it more as a flashback of this one and a flashback of this one and a flashback of this one from, and like a, where do you want the story's energy to go? So it can work either way.
yeah, that's great. That makes me feel a little better. I've been kind of torturing myself of what is my, what is my, how do I make her grow or change her? But I guess she did. So
Yeah. Yeah. And, she ended her life surrounded by people she loved in a family that in the beginning of her story felt so separated from her, right? Like, so she starts being born as she was the youngest. Am I
youngest of
right?
6. Yeah.
So she's the youngest of this family that, like, the whole world could be in front of them. And then just 3 years later, all of that is taken away from her. And then it's like her arc, if you will, is getting her back to this place of, in her later years, she has this wonderfully large family that maybe looks different than what she could have had if her father hadn't died when she was 3. But it's that wonderful, large, loving family that she had at the beginning that she worked her whole life to create. So
I mean, you also have kind of in the background that, had her father not died and had they all stayed there, they probably would have all died in the Holocaust. So,
right,
um,
right, which is, such a, and that's the story that you're telling about people who are so interested in history, especially Jewish history and the heritage and what it was like in Eastern Europe and Western Europe at the time. And like, so there's definitely so much story here that people will read. So now, since we're talking about the world wars and the impact that they had on her life, um, do you intend to include that as part of the story? I don't know how you could tell it without that. Um,
which
in your grandmother's story, like as the memoir, like when she tells the story of her life, does she talk about that a lot and you want to bring that in, or was that more like separated because she had already moved at the time?
I mean, she came because of World War I.
Mm-hmm.
It was about to begin. It was beginning, and her mother didn't want her unprotected.
Mm-hmm.
They were where they lived was clearly going to be in the path of the war.
Mm.
Um, but World War II, I mean, both her sons were in war. All three of her sons were in World War II, so that was a
Mm-hmm.
big.
Yeah.
But in terms of, the Holocaust and who was lost, she didn't really talk about. Nobody talked
Mm-hmm.
about that in that
Sure.
generation.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, and again, it feels like so much of her life was decided for her because of other events, and yet she still persevered throughout. She still ended her life married with 4 wonderful children and 9 grandchildren. So even though she didn't have a lot of choices, it really feels like she kind of made the best out of what she had.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, the Depression was in there also. It was one of the, they lost everything. So
Yeah.
my father told stories about, finding coal on the tracks to heat their house kind of thing. But
Yeah.
yeah, it pretty much spans history, I guess.
Which again makes it a really compelling story that people are going to want to read. So,
I hope you're right.
okay. So from a decision-making perspective, you've been working on this. It feels like, as we were kind of talking through, there were some questions about like, what do I do next? How do I move forward? You have the genre question. We talked a little bit about the audience. We talked a little bit about, how do you tell the story based off of character voice and based off of like character growth and those sorts of things. And obviously, again, I don't feel like any of those are resolved. If you feel like they're resolved, wonderful, but it was more the idea to kind of talk about them. Do you have any other questions that are kind of weighing on you before you are able to take the draft you have and take your next steps?
I don't think so. I think you pretty much, I was just looking at what I wrote to you. I think, I think I need to listen to the dialogue doctor a bunch more and get voice, how to develop a voice, her voice.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I have a lot to think about.
Okay. So let's take a minute then and talk a little bit about how someone can help you as you're moving through this process, right? Because writing a book, again, never having done it myself, but watching a lot of people write their first novel. Some of the things that I have seen and experienced are people feeling like they don't have the ability or maybe the authority to be able to write like, oh, I hope I can tell the story. I hope I can do this justice. Then there's well, what do I do? How do I know what's next? Questions that come in. And then okay, well, I have this draft, but I don't know what I'm missing because I'm not an editor kind of question, right? So kind of thinking through next steps, let's talk about what can be really effective for a writer to have a partner in that process to kind of get them through the hurdles. Now, the Dialogue Doctor does offer book coaching for people who are in this situation. But there are lots of other people in the world other than the Dialogue Doctor who can come alongside of you to be a partner, or for anybody else who's listening who feels like, oh, I really need somebody to do this with me. I just don't know who to pick. So you want to pick someone who is encouraging, but is also going to be honest with you, right? So when I want encouragement, I call my mother, because my mother is my biggest champion. I can never do anything wrong. I could give her something and I could be like, hey, will you read this and give me feedback? And it doesn't matter what that is. She's going to tell me that I am the smartest person and this is the best thing that's ever written, because that's the kind of cheerleader she is. It makes a really great partner for making me feel good that I can move on to the world and tackle anything. Doesn't, however, make a really good editor, because when you have an editor, you need somebody who's going to be honest with you. So, but at the same time, like you give something to somebody and all you get are the critiques, and there's no like, yes, this is really good and this is exciting, and right, like, so you have to find somebody who's going to balance that with you, who's going to see your vision and allow you to like find the parts of your vision that aren't aligning for the reader. So if you can think of somebody like that, some people use their partners, some people run very far away from their partners. Like, no, my partner is not the person who is going to do this for me. So, just kind of think about the people in your life who ideally, you're going to find somebody who is as excited about your story as you are, because it makes it a little easier to take the critiques and the constructive criticisms when you know the person you're working with also wants that goal of this being in the world. So, do you have anybody in your life?
Well, I've been taking a memoir class, and the class group has kind of formed a writing group that's so I've read little bits of it and gotten, feedback of exactly like what you give on the dialogue doctor, like, needs more dialogue. You need to move this here and put that there.
Right.
And that kind of thing. But I would love to be able to have, to have an editor that I could send sections to, that knew the whole story. And
Yep. So, okay. So finding somebody you trust who's going to be encouraging and also honest with you is really important. Finding somebody who has the same vision, let me rephrase that. We don't want them to have the same vision. We want them to honor your vision. So as an editor, some people look at an editor as somebody who is supposed to come in and tell you all the places that need to change. I don't think that that's a fair opportunity as a writer, because it's not my book. My name should never be on someone else's book. If somebody wants to like mention me in like the whatever acknowledgements, great, I'm honored that they valued my opinion enough to put me there, but that's not what an editor's job is, right? Like an editor should never really be seen in the process except by the writer. So you want to find somebody who is going to point out the opportunities to go certain different ways, but isn't going to feel offended or hurt when their ideas aren't taken. I can't tell you how many times I've had a session with a writer and I'm like, okay, so I see an opportunity here to do this or this, and I think you could do this, or I think you could do this. And then they're like, okay. And in their mind, like I can watch them going, no, that's not going to work. No, that's not going to work. Like I can see it on their face and I just can't stop myself because now I'm so invested in their story. I'm like, and then you can do this and you can do this and you can do this. And then they give me the next draft and I read it. I'm like, oh, this is so much better. Thank you for not taking any of my suggestions. Right? Like, so you need somebody who has the passion for your vision, wants to go on the journey with you, but also can go, you know what? This isn't my book. It's not my story. My job is to just offer suggestions. It's not to tell you what's right or wrong. So that's the other thing that you really want to look for. And then the third thing that I would suggest when you're looking for someone who is going to work with you is someone who complements your strengths. So as a writer, even as a new writer, you have great things about yourself as a writer in some areas, right? Maybe you're really good at like telling the story, but you're not great at finding the characters' voices. Maybe you are really great at finding the characters' voices, but you're not great at seeing the holes in your plot, right? Like, how do these two things line up? Or maybe you're good at those two things, but you're not great at finding the emotionality of the scene. Like you're telling the story really well and the voices are really exciting, but your readers don't actually feel anything when they're reading.
That's me, I think.
That's where you are. Okay. So then what you want to do is you want to find a writing partner who really is in tune to the emotion. and can really sit down with you and take your chapters, because this is something that you really kind of want to do at the chapter level, is like, because sometimes trying to find the emotion in a full story can be really overwhelming, especially one when the story is already written. Like, you can't make changes to the story because the life already happened, right? When you're creating a fictional character, you can change the storyline to meet the whims, but that's not what you want to do here. So you want to find somebody who's really in tune with the emotion of the story. And you want them to be able to leave you notes in your margin that are like, here, I wanted to feel happy. Like, the story makes me want to feel happy, but I just kind of feel like I'm reading somebody else's story, and I'm happy for her, but I don't feel happy. So how do I turn the story around in that moment? And the dialogue doctor teaches all kinds of ways of being able to do that. One of the ways that we help people pull you into the emotion is to create dialogue, right? A little harder in a memoir because you want to be accurate, but at the same time you want to be able to pull that conversation in. But like, putting words in people's mouth allows us to experience the emotion with them instead of hearing what they're saying. So the other thing, so once you get the dialogue in their mouth, then things like body language and modulation of cadence and pacing help us feel the feelings instead of being told. So, and then she felt sad feels really different than swallow hard, say the sentence, wiping away the tears, right? Like, those feel as a reader really different because we're experiencing the emotion. And I don't know about you, but when my protagonist wipes away their tears, my hand is always at my eye. I'm not necessarily tearing up, but I'm mirroring what my protagonist, or the vehicle character, as the dialogue doctor likes to talk about it. So finding people, even if you don't have an editor who knows the dialogue doctor style or knows some of these other writing styles that can tell you this is how you fix this section, that doesn't matter. You need to find somebody who knows how to identify the fact that something needs work, because you can always, as a writer, once you know something needs work, you can go in and you can do your research and you can play around with it and you can kind of try different things. And you can post something in the Slack channel and be like, hey, I'm trying something here. Community dialoguers, help me out here. What am I doing well? What do I need help with? Right. So like, you don't always need to pay somebody to be the person who comes in alongside of you and helps you as you're writing. There are people in your life, and maybe you need to have a couple of different people. Maybe you do need to have one person who's your cheerleader. Maybe you do need to have one person who's your critic. Maybe you need one person who's your emotional reader. Whatever works best for you. But those are really the things that I recommend that people find, especially when they're kind of like writing their first story.
That makes sense, definitely.
So I don't know about you, but like, kind of the peek behind the curtain on how a book gets written, for me, was like, there was just kind of some magic. As I've read a ton as a child, and I always thought like writers just sat down at their,
You just write it. Yeah.
right. Like, I just thought that stories just happened. I had no idea there was so much like collaboration and back and forth, and like, what about this? And what do you think about that? But I'm always so excited to have a conversation like this with someone like you who's just starting their journey and knows that they have this really great story to tell, but isn't really sure how to get it into the world. So thank you so much for sharing your story with me and your time with me.
Thank you so much for all your help. It's amazing.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to go ahead and turn the recording off now.